Hey, Freddy with CJ Pony Parts. One of the best things about owning a truck is the ground clearance and off-road capabilities, but a lot of truck owners want to further improve the ground clearance and attitude of their truck, and one way of doing that is by installing a leveling kit. Today we're going to be installing the Skyjacker 2-inch leveling kit on this 2016 F-150 to give it more ground clearance, attitude, and room for a bigger tire. This Skyjacker 2-inch leveling kit comes with metal spacers that mount on the front struts to lift the front of the truck 2 inches, making it level with the rear. This leveling kit is significantly easier to install and more affordable than a complete lift kit, and it still gives the truck improved ground clearance and off-road capabilities while maintaining the factory ride quality. And today we're going to be installing this on this 2016 F-150. Tools you'll need for this installation: a lift and a pull jack or a jack and jack stands, 3/8 ratchet, 8mm socket, 10mm socket, 16mm socket, 1/2-inch ratchet, a very powerful impact gun or air gun, 15mm socket, 17mm socket, 18mm socket, 21mm socket, 27mm socket, a 15mm wrench, 18mm wrench, a Sharpie, hammer, a big pry bar, and a high-quality spring compressor. The first step of this process is to obviously get the truck up in the air and take the wheel off. Once you get it up in the air, you need to remove the strut assembly itself, which basically you need to remove everything in here: the upper control arm, the tie rod, the sway bar end link, loosen the lower control arms. Basically everything in here has to come undone. So we're going to start off by undoing these bolts right here. There's 3 bolts securing all the brake lines. There's an 8mm bolt here, a 10, and a 10. I like to put the bolts back where they came from, just so I don't lose them. Moving on to the big nuts and bolts now, remove the 21mm nut on the tie rod. With an 18mm socket, you can remove the lower strut nuts and also the sway bar end link nut. If you go to loosen the sway bar end link stud and the nut turns with the stud, grab yourself an 18mm wrench, then an 8mm socket. Remove the 18mm nut securing the ball joint to the steering knuckle. Grab yourself a good size hammer and whack right here on the steering knuckle to release the ball joint. Now this step might not be entirely necessary, but you can loosen up the lower control arm nuts right here, and it'll help with lowering the lower control arm to give you more room. And these nuts are very tight, so you'll need a good breaker bar for these. Before you loosen up the nuts on the top of the strut, I found that it makes it a lot easier if before you loosen them, take a pry bar and put it under the strut right here. If you don't do this, when you loosen the nuts on the top, the whole assembly will drop and go down back into these slots here, and it'll make it really difficult to remove it because it'll probably drop and twist. And if you don't do this, it really will make it a lot more difficult to remove it. So I highly recommend, before loosening the nuts on the top, put a pry bar underneath. It really will make it a lot easier. All 3 nuts up top are 18mm. We've got all 3 nuts off up top, push down on the pry bar. Now to basically make this possible to reinstall once we get the leveling kit on it, we're going to hammer out these studs so we have enough room. We're going to put the nuts back on each stud. Grab yourself your sledgehammer, hold this really secure, and you're just going to hit on the end of these studs until they pop out. The leveling kit comes with 2 pieces. One spacer goes beneath this top hat right here, the other spacer goes on top. In order to get the spacer below this top hat, we're going to need to compress the spring. These springs are really, really tight, so you're going to need a really good, high quality spring compressor for this. That's going to be really important for safety. You don't want to use a cheap one that could seriously injure you or someone else. A very powerful electric gun or an air gun is really going to be helpful with tightening this. There is a lot of tension on this spring. With the spring compressed, you can remove the 17mm nut on top of the top hat that secures the strut. Remove the top hat. Set the strut aside. Remove the insulator. The Skyjacker kit comes with replacement bolts, so we need to hammer out the factory studs. So at this point we could try to install the spacer, but it doesn't go down all the way. We need to remove this plastic collar. Install this spacer with these slots facing up. Then you can reinstall this collar. I'm going to lubricate everything up just to make it easier to adjust if we don't get it on perfectly. Install these bolts that's supplied in the kit. Then install the rubber insulator. And if it needs to, it can turn pretty easily now because it's lubricated. Before we install this on the strut, we're going to test fit it and see how it fits. This will actually only go on one way. As you can see, there's 3 studs up here. It has to be in this order. If it's like that, it won't fit. If it's like that, it won't fit. It has to be in this exact position. So what we're going to do is get it up in there. Then we're going to mark it so we know where to put it on the strut. So now we're going to mark it right where it needs to be installed. It can only fit in this way, so the strut's going to come down here and go right into the lower control arm. So I'm going to try to make a mark right here to have this line up basically center with the strut. So now that we added a spacer to the top hat, the studs don't come out so we can't get a nut on it. We need to compress it a little bit more. Now that the threads are showing, we can get the nut on it. Now we can try to line it up. So I'm basically trying to get this silver mark to go straight down the strut and in between the bottom mount here. So I place the mark and hoping that it'll be dead center with the mount right here so it's clocked in the right position. Tighten up the nut. And it might turn on you. This is why we lubricated it. If it wasn't lubricated, it actually might not spin with it being on here like this. We can now release the tension from the spring. We do need to put the other spacer on top of here, but before we do, we're just going to make sure that this is in the right position. As you can see, the bottom mount lines up as well as the studs up top. Now we can put the spacer on. Put the top spacer on, then put it in the truck. Once you get it in, put the nuts on up top. Tighten up the nuts up top. They are 15mm nuts. We're now going to use a pole jack to lift everything up so it's easier to reinstall. Take the studs that you previously hammered out and reinstall them. Give these bolts a little love taps to get them in. Put the nuts on the stud. And power tools are really going to come in handy for this part. You're going to draw the stud all the way down by tightening it. Reinstall the tie rod. This might be the more difficult part. You're gonna have to jack up the lower control arm and pull down on the ball joint to get the stud in the knuckle. And if it starts to spin like what it's doing right now, take the socket off, put a wrench on here, and an 8mm socket right here. Reinstall the nut on the sway bar end link, and then use an 18mm wrench and an 8mm socket to reinstall it. To tighten up the lower control arm bolts, you're going to need a 21mm socket and a 27. Reinstall all the brake lines. Now just put the wheel on, repeat the process on the other side, and your installation is finished. The Skyjacker 2-inch leveling kit is installed. It lifted the front of the truck about 2 inches, making it nice and level with the rear. We have a lot more room up here now for a bigger tire. And you want to make sure you get in alignment after this. It could be off just so slightly. Installation should take about 3 to 4 hours, and before you know it, you'll be heading down the road.